Welcome, everyone. My name is Leah. I'm the Director of Knowledge Exchange at Women's Shelters Canada. I'm going to be hosting our webinar today, and I'm really looking forward to it. This is the final webinar in our three-part series. So it's the exciting conclusion, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. I will start by saying that I am joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I recognize that as a settler, I have a responsibility to continue to learn about the historical and present impacts of settler colonialism and to support the work of reconciliation and decolonization. Now, I know there are folks joining us from across the country today. We'd love to know who's here, so do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say hi, let us know where you're joining from. We'd love to know who's here. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we do have interpretation today. So if you head down to the bottom of your screen, you will see that there's a globe that says interpretation, and you can pick either English or French, depending on what language you want to listen in. You have probably noticed that you don't have the ability to turn on your video or your microphone, so only the presenters are going to have their video and mics on today. And that's just to make sure we do have really clear audio for the interpreters and for everyone else. But we do want your participation. And so you can look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat box. That's a great place to let us know any comments, to say hi and introduce yourself. If you have any technical issues, please let me know in the chat and I will do my best to address those. If you have a question for our presenters, and we do hope to have lots of time for questions, lots of discussion. So if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A box, not the chat. That way it doesn't get lost and we can get to everyone's questions. We are recording today's webinar. We will share the recording and a copy of the PowerPoints afterwards. And the recordings will be up on our website as well. And I think that's it for the housekeeping. So without further ado, I'll share that, as I said, today is the last in our three-part series, which has been focusing on, giving shelter and transition houses the overview of the development process. We started off with feasibility a couple weeks ago. The second session was on design and development, and now today we are looking at construction and operations. For all three of these webinars, if you've been following along by now, you know Megan, Kyla, and Amanda. But for those who weren't at the first two, Kyla and Megan are our wonderful second stage transitional housing new build team here at Women's Shelters Canada, and they'll tell you a bit more about that. And Amanda Owens is the executive director of the Ksan Society in BC, and she'll be speaking a bit later in the session today. So the last thing I'm going to do before handing over to Kyla and Megan is launch a poll. So this is to give us a sense of who's here and what you're interested in. So if you could take a moment and let us know where you're joining from today. BC, the Prairie Provinces, Territories, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic, etc. And then we also want to know, what would you like to learn more about following this webinar series? So some of the options there are the overall development process, early feasibility tasks, pre-construction funding, designing a building, working with a design team, securing total project funding, construction, and operating the building. So there's lots of options there. If there's something else we didn't mention, you can put it in the chat, of course. So I see folks are filling that out. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or a minute, make sure everyone can get their answers in. Okay, and it looks like most folks have responded, so I'm going to share those results. We have a good contingent here from Ontario today. We have BC, the Prairie Provinces, and some folks from Quebec and the Atlantic area, so that's great. And pretty mixed interests here, which is really interesting. So lots of interest in securing project funding. That's probably the biggest one there. But equally, operating the building, designing a building, feasibility, the overall process. So really interest in almost everything here, which is great to know. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, and without any further ado, I will hand it over to Kyla and Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Leah. So welcome to our Introduction to the Development Process webinar series, our final webinar. As Leah said, my name is Kyla Tanner. I'm the Development Project Manager at Women's Shelters Canada, and I'm joined by Megan Golfetto, our Project Coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada, and Amanda Owens, the Executive Director at Ksan Society in British Columbia. And we're looking forward to sharing with you today. To start, Megan and I are going to introduce ourselves a bit more, and Amanda's going to provide her introduction later in the presentation. So I've been working in affordable housing development for nonprofits and charities since 2019. And over the last 4 years, I've assisted many organizations through the entire development process as a project manager. And this involves everything from creating a feasible project, applying for funding, navigating design and development, and construction phases, which is topics that we've talked about in this 3-part webinar series. But my passion for the right to safe and adequate housing for women and children led me to join the VAW shelter community in 2022 at Women's Shelters Canada.
Hi, everyone. My name's Megan. I've been working in the violence against women shelter sector since 2019 with experience as both a frontline worker and as a fundraising and communications professional. From my direct work with women and children fleeing violence, I've seen families struggle to find housing that meets their needs, as I'm sure many of you here today have also witnessed. I've also seen the essential life-saving services that shelters and transition houses provide, many of whom do not have adequate operational funding to keep their doors open, let alone the time and funds to explore building more housing and more shelters. So these are some of the reasons why I'm especially passionate about the creation of more affordable spaces for women and children fleeing violence.
Okay, so why did we do a 3-part webinar series on the development process? We realized that many executive directors find the development world unfamiliar and intimidating. Essentially, you don't know what you don't know, so embarking on a new project can be really overwhelming. On top of that, you're juggling this all alongside your regular responsibilities, which is incredibly stressful. So we see it as like you're doing another job off the side of your desk that you don't have previous experience in. So in response, we created this 3-part series to help kind of demystify the development process, offer you a clearer understanding of what it takes to build a new facility. And we want to make the process less daunting, or at the very least, help you identify which aspects might be challenging and how you can seek support. So over the 3 sessions, we've been going over the basics of the development process. We've identified key steps to building a new building, addressed questions like who to hire for your team, when to bring those people on board, and what is everybody's roles and responsibilities throughout the process. And we know that the development landscape can be like confusing, time consuming, and probably an area where you've limited exposure. So by the end of today, we hope that you'll feel more confident about your role and really what next steps to take for your project. So today's session is the 3rd and final one. We're going to discuss both construction and operation phases. And if you've missed either of our previous 2 webinars, they were recorded and they're currently available on our website, so you can watch them at any time. And just note that the series overall is a high-level overview. So each phase that we touch upon could easily be a webinar series on its own, but we wanted to provide you with this overview to begin your learning journey. Just to start, we're going to do a recap of both the first and second webinars, just kind of like their key takeaways as a bit of a reminder. And then we're going to dive into construction, followed by operations. But we'll pause for questions twice throughout the presentation. And then we'll turn things over to Amanda to share her experience with construction and operations and answer questions from a VAW shelter perspective. So let's start with a brief recap from the first webinar, feasibility. So we know that the feasibility analysis phase is a really time-intensive process, and it could span many years. You're going to want to designate a single person as the champion to lead and advocate for the project. You want to make sure you're allocating dedicated staff time for the process, and you can consider hiring a project manager to help facilitate this too, so they can leverage their expertise and essentially use the ED to focus on your primary role. You might need to hire some others, like an architect for early concept design, but you have to make sure that the project's financially viable before you move into the next phase. And that's the reason for the first takeaway, is that it could take many years before you actually create something viable. But essentially the work that's conducted in this phase, it can be compiled into, we might call it like a business case or a feasibility study, but you have a nice package at the end that demonstrates all the work you've done, and you can use that to apply for funding. So once you have the viable project, then you're moving into the design and development phase. In design development, you're going to make sure that all of the core team members that you're hiring are sharing your project vision and are committed to this success that you are. So having a dedicated team is really important. You want to make sure that these are people who are going to back you, be patient with your project, and support you throughout. You're also going to have to spend money in this phase, and sometimes that's before you've had success with a grant. So prepare your board to take some risks along the way. There'll be calculated risks. So you want to make sure that you're educating them on the process. And you might actually want to have them watch this webinar series that could be useful for them. You're also going to be engaging the staff who are going to operate the building, and you want to do that in the early stages of this phase because their insights are really valuable. And the earlier you have them, the easier it is to make changes to the design, as opposed to waiting till you're almost in construction. Then those changes become expensive. You're also going to try and strike a balance between the ideal design of your building and the costs. So cost implications will come up when you're making decisions. Always make sure you're asking more questions. So if the architect is asking you to choose between two things, or they're proposing something and you think you want it, always make sure you're asking, well, how much does this cost? A lot of the steps that are happening in this phase are going to happen at the same time. So planning and community engagement is going to happen all at the same time as securing the funding, progressing your designs, doing financial analysis. It's a pretty big phase, and lots of work is being done. And finally, just make sure that you've got some reserve funds available to continue with the project. So you might have some success in securing pre-construction funding, but that could be spent quickly. And once you have the success with the multi-million-dollar construction funding, you might not actually be able to use it right away. So there's a point in there that you might have to spend some of your own money. Okay, so let's dive into the third phase, which is construction. The primary purpose of this phase is to successfully bring your building to life. It's probably one of the more straightforward phases because it's really tangible, it's easy to conceptualize. You're actually going to see a physical building being created. We're going to go over these 5 key activities that you're going to be involved in during the phase of construction. So there will be some construction administration. There'll be schedule and budget monitoring. You're going to do funding advances. So this is receiving the money from your funder. And that can be a bit of a complex process, but you can think of this as your cash flow. It's how you're paying for all your monthly bills. And then as construction is nearing completion, you're going to be preparing to operate the building. And then finally, it's wrap up, which is ensuring that the building was built as you intended. The outputs that you're going to have is that you might actually start with trying to do a groundbreaking ceremony. We recommend this to be able to celebrate a really big milestone, and it's going to happen at the beginning of construction. At the end of construction, your building's complete, your hard work is paid off. You're probably going to do a grand opening ceremony, which Megan's going to discuss a bit in the operations phase. And then you're also going to complete any final funding draws and reports to funders as they require them. And with construction concluded and the building ready to go, your residents are moving in, which is a great output to have. How long is this going to take? The timelines really do vary. It depends on your project size and complexity. So for a small project, there's one that Megan and I are working on right now. They're 5 units, they're in a rural area, and it's an extension off their existing building. Their construction timeline is 8 months. That's the shortest I've actually ever seen. So maybe about 8 to 12 months would be kind of for a smaller project. Something that's a bit more average would be 12 to 24 months. And in some cases, projects will extend beyond 24 months. You definitely see this if you're located in the north or a really remote area. The construction timeline is just going to be a lot longer. Okay, so during construction administration, a lot's going to be happening during this. We're going to go over each of these items. To begin, there's going to be some bi-weekly site meetings that are actually going to be conducted by your builder. The architect, project manager, and owner will all be there. These used to be done in person, actually on site. We learned how to do things virtually during the pandemic. So some projects, they're continuing to do that. It kind of depends on where everybody's located too, but if you're able to save some travel costs, then you can always try and do them virtually. The architect is going to be reviewing the quality of work on site, and they'll be there at least once a month, and they'll produce a site visit report. A quantity surveyor, that's somebody who you've probably hired earlier for your costing. They're going to be reviewing the project costs. So they're all about the money. And then a big task that's going to happen that you're involved in is the change orders. So a change order is a change to work, price, schedule, or contract, but essentially it's a change to something that you've agreed upon. And it's coming up because something unanticipated is going to happen. So maybe the ground was different than expected. If it was a lot harder or softer, but that will make changes based on the drawings and how they were originally going to do it. So you might need a different level of engineered fill in the ground, for example. The project that we're working on with the extension, the foundation of the existing building they're expanding from is actually crumbling. So there's a little bit of extra cost there just to build up the existing foundation. Or I've also seen on a project where the siding contractor actually just went out of business when we were in the middle of construction. So we needed to award that work to someone else. These are all change orders that come up. So they'll be identified by either your builder, your architect, or yourself as the owner, and they will come with associated costs. In most cases, it's an additional cost. In very few, you'll get actually reimbursed. If you have more of those, that's great, but it's a little unlikely. And how you're paying for these additional costs is with your contingency. So we talked about the contingency in the last webinar. Essentially, it's money that you added to your project budget to save for a rainy day. Okay, so this is the rainy day. This is the unexpected thing that has come up. So this is when you're using your contingency. The change order process, it depends on the change order, but there might actually be a little bit of negotiating on the price. It would depend on your construction contract that you have, if you're allowed. It also depends on the change. So for example, if you're the one saying, oh, we want different faucets, and you're changing to a more expensive one, then you will be paying for that. But in terms of maybe the ground not being the same, maybe that's split across a couple different people. You can always try and negotiate. You're going to be notified of the change order as the owner. Documentation is going to be created for your approval, and then you're going to sign off on it. And then they'll go and do the work, and then it'll be on the next bill. There's going to be an administration fee also added to the change orders. Usually it's about 15%. That's kind of like overhead for the time and like admin time of the builder, but also it's a little bit because it's the service that they're offering. And so they do make a little bit of profit. So again, thinking of like that faucet change, you want to make that faucet change in design development, because if you're making that change in construction, you're getting charged for the difference and you're getting an extra 15% added on. And the final administration task that's going to be happening is also some periodic reporting on your progress to funders. And that requirement depends on who your funder is, federal, provincial, or municipal. As an example, we know that Alberta requires quarterly reporting. So every few months that we're creating a report and sending it to them, just giving them an update on the project. Schedule and budget monitoring is also very important. So you want to make sure that you're on schedule and you're on budget. If the project's off on either of those two things, you as the owner really need to know right away. So your project manager should be creating monthly reports. That's going to provide kind of a general project status update. Megan and I do this for any project that we're project managing. We're highlighting key milestones, any challenges, and definitely the progress. So what's been happening since the last month. You can then bring those to your board. So you're probably having monthly board meetings. You can bring that report, send it to them the week in advance, and go over kind of some of the major things that have happened. Stuff like maybe the schedule slipped because there was way more rain than was in the forecast. Or maybe the framing has actually started on the building and your board members should drive by the site because it's starting to look like a real building. That's always like a nice thing that happens. You're also going to be getting schedule updates. So your builder is going to tell you these in those biweekly site meetings. So you'll be hearing like, oh, we finished the concrete pour and next we're starting to do the framing, that kind of thing. But you're also going to get an updated monthly schedule from the builder. And yeah, they're going to be sending that to you once a month, probably at the same time as their billing. So that's something else you're getting once a month. And the billing is a bit of a process. So it actually starts with what we call like a progress claim or a progress bill. And that's sort of like a draft invoice that gets sent to you as the owner, and then it gets reviewed. Your project manager should be reviewing it. And then it's likely the architect, although it could be the quantity surveyor. They're going to validate that claim. So essentially they'll look at all of the costs that are included on there and say, yes, these are all correct. I've been on site and we are being charged for the wood and the plumbing, and that's all the work that's being done. For example, if shingles were on there and you're not even getting to the roof, then they're going to go back and say, hey, you need to change this. And then the final invoice is sent. We're going to get into that process of paying an invoice a little bit more in the coming slides, but and just knowing that it's a bit of a process and that you're getting these things monthly from your builder. You're also going to be monitoring the contingency. So if a lot of change orders are coming up, you want to know how much you've spent versus how much you still have available for the contingency. So for an example, if you're 30% through your project, but you've actually spent 60% of your contingency, you know that it's likely additional funding could be required, or maybe how you're responding to some of these change orders needs to change. So maybe you did want different faucets, but knowing that you're eating through the contingency, you're not going to change them and that you're happy with the ones that are already in there and already included in the billing. And then the monthly invoices. So I guess, yeah, we just touched upon that a little bit, but just noting that the ones that you're getting from the builder, once they're at their final stage, they can be substantial. So they could be hundreds of thousands of dollars to even a couple million, depends on the overall price of your project. But know that the payment that you're going to be, like how you're paying for those invoices is using the funding that you've received, but that gets a bit complicated. So we're going to dive into that in this next slide. So we use the term cash flow a lot. And that's just basically making sure that you're using the funding that you had allocated, that you secured, that you applied for and were granted, that you're using that to pay these bills. Your builder's bill, but there's going to be other ones too, like your architect, your project manager. They'll all be giving you monthly bills. So the way that you're getting your funding from the funder could be a few different ways. It's very unlikely that you're getting kind of a lump sum upfront payment. So if you've applied and you were successful and got a $3 million grant, they don't just like sign it over to you and put it into your account, and then you use that money to build your building. If that's the case, consider yourself really lucky, but I actually haven't seen it done that way. Instead, we see two really common ways. The first one is like these milestone payments. So that's tied to construction progress. So for example, you'll get 30% of that $3 million. So you get $1 million at 30% completion of the project. Okay, we've seen that both for municipal as well as provincial funding programs. So it's fairly common. The other way of doing it is that you actually have to request funding based on the invoices that you've received. And that's how CMHC does it. That one's a bit more complicated. We're going to dive into it on the next slide. But just know that, for the milestone ones where you're having to demonstrate that you're at 30%, it's just really usually a simple report. It's something that your architect can create for you, where when you're requesting the funding based on invoices, it's a quite detailed process. So let's look at that closer. We're going to use CMHC as the example here, just because that one's the most common. This might be used in your province as well, but I think most often it's that national funder. So bear with me as I walk through the process. It's going to get a bit complicated, but we're going to try and keep it as simple as possible. So CMHC is going to let you draw funding from them only once a month and only on a Thursday. Okay, so that's already very specific. What Megan and I do is we actually create a calendar. So you can see it over here on the right. And this is to facilitate that whole draw process. And we do this every single month of construction. So we're drawing funding from CMHC once a month. And what we're doing, or why we're doing this, is because, for example, the invoice is $1 million. You probably don't have $1 million just like in your account not being used for anything to pay the bill. So instead, you're going to be really organized to be able to receive your invoice, do all of the steps in that process, and then receive funding from CMHC to pay your bill. And you need to pay your bill within 28 days. Sometimes they'll say 30, but there is a Prompt Payment Act. So you should be doing 28 days. And if you are beyond this, you will be charged interest, which you don't want to be doing. It's not a perfect metaphor, but you can think of this kind of like personally, if you're using your credit card to pay for like a really big purchase because you actually don't have enough money in your bank account to pay for it outright, but you don't want to get charged interest on your card. So what you're going to do is make sure that when you're getting, when you're buying it on your credit card, that you're going to align it with your payday so that you've got money in your account to pay off your credit card bill within that month so that you're not getting charged interest. It's not perfect, but it's kind of similar. Some of the differences is that actually to get the money, so to get your payday, I guess, from CMHC, is you need all these documents that we've listed here. You need the payment certification. So I mentioned that on the last slide. That's coming from your architect or maybe your quantity surveyor. It's most commonly the architect. You're going to give them a construction schedule. So you're getting that from your builder. You're going to do a drawdown schedule. This is a bit more complicated, but essentially CMHC asks you to project out over the lifetime of construction how much money you need from them each month and which day you want it. It's never going to be the exact thing. You're anticipating this, you're projecting it, but they want that estimate. You're going to give them all the invoices you've received from that last month, so whatever adds to that $1 million. And you have to give them a quantity surveyor report. That's a given. That's not dependent on the payment certification. You have to do, we call them a QS report. So we know that CMHC only gives funding on a Thursday. So you can see the Thursday down at the bottom of the screen here. It's got like the red and the pink in the box. And then you have to count backwards 10 days because CMHC requires 10 business days for them to evaluate the whole package that you've sent them and give you the money. So that's actually like 2 weeks in terms of calendar days. So the quantity surveyor has to provide their report in advance of that draw date. So they're like the one right before the 1 day, but they actually need a whole bunch of things from you to do their report. So they need the invoices, the payment certificate, WorkSafe reports, and more. And they need time to create their report. So we've given them a week here. In some cases, they can maybe turn this around in 3 days, but that depends on your quantity surveyor. So in this example, we've given them a week, but in that amount of time, so now that means you have to get the invoice less than a week before that, and you need that payment certification done by your architect. So this is just to demonstrate that you've got a whole bunch of things and they're all dependent on one another, and you have to turn them around all in the 28 days, right? So this is why we think that the calendar is really helpful. It's hard to keep track of it all otherwise. And it's important because if you miss one of these days and then CMHC doesn't get the report in time, they're not going to give you money until the next Thursday. And by then you should have paid your bill to the builder. And just to note here that honestly, the most difficult part for Megan and I is actually following up with everyone. So we've like color coded people's boxes. We send this to them in advance. They've got their deadline. They don't send it to us by the deadline, and you're following up with them the next day. So, we stay as organized as we can just to take kind of the effort out of it, because there's always going to be the effort of kind of chasing people. And then we're not going to get into this part here, but just noting that tax reimbursement will also be coordinated at the same time. So if you're a charity, you should be getting 50% of your GST back and also a portion of your provincial tax too. This might be 50% or even higher for your provincial part. So that stuff is being dealt with on the side. Okay, so then preparing to operate. So you want to start thinking about operating your building while you're in construction, about maybe 6 months before occupancy. And you're going to want to re-engage your operations team if they haven't been too involved during construction, which they wouldn't need to be. Megan and I are working on a list of items that you're going to want to check to ensure all of them are done. And she's actually going to go over a few of these in detail in the operations part of this presentation, but just noting that you're probably going to draft your program agreements for residents to sign, especially if you're doing second stage. Any kind of operational policies or procedures, a move-in schedule for the first residents, a budget for your first year of operation. And if you're not the one doing the property management, just making sure that you're coordinating with that company who is, and making sure that you're both on the same page. But essentially the goal is that you don't want anything to fall between the cracks and that you want a really smooth transition to opening. Okay, and then the final activity I'm going to go over is construction wrap-up. And this is a term actually that you're going to hear from people in the industry, but it's essentially making sure that your building was built and operates as intended, as designed. So you might have hired a third-party commissioning agent. We mentioned them in the last webinar as well. This would be a mechanical or electrical engineering firm that checks the project. And we advise hiring them if you have a really complex system or a larger building. If you're not one of those things, then you might not have one. But if you hired them for early on in your design, this is when they're getting engaged as well. The first milestone in wrap-up is substantial completion. So this is when your building has reached a point where it can be occupied or used for its intended purpose. It's really actually a significant milestone, and everybody's going to be talking about it as a specific date. And then that triggers different legal and financial implications, such as release of holdback payments, I'll talk about in a second, and the start of your warranty periods. After substantial completion has been achieved, then the building is essentially it's complete. And then it triggers this process of inspection. And that's checking for any defects or deficiencies. So that's a really thorough examination of the building, looking for issues with like the finishes, functionality of systems, any cosmetic imperfections that you note. And then once they've been identified, they're documented, given to the construction team and then your builder, and they're going to fix them. Okay, so it's making sure that you're getting a complete product essentially at the end. Who is checking for the defects and deficiencies? It's a whole team. It is going to be the builder and as well as their subcontractors. So you're going to do a walkthrough together, them, the architect and engineers who are involved in the design, your project manager, as well as the owner of the building. So you'll all get to do a walkthrough together. The next key step is what we call handover or ready for takeover. And, you know, the defects and deficiencies might still be getting fixed up, right? Like maybe there's a ding on a cabinet in one of the units that actually doesn't prevent you from getting the keys and taking possession of the building. You can start moving in furniture, for example, or even occupying some of the other units while these defects and deficiencies are being addressed. You are going to need an occupancy permit for the building before you move in the residence, and your architect or your builder can help you with that. You're also going to coordinate release of holdback. So I mentioned that holdback. So this is going to the builder 60 days after substantial completion. What is a holdback? So earlier we used the example of an invoice being $1 million. So you see that on your bill, but then actually you only pay 900,000 of it. 10% is held back. And that's on every single invoice throughout all of construction. And it's held back until the very end, so until 60 days after substantial completion. And the purpose is to really provide like this security that the contractor and subcontractors are doing the work, you know, satisfactorily, basically. Another thing that's happening is that you'll get some operating and maintenance instructions. So how you operate the building from like a mechanical side of things. So like your HVAC system. In some cases, buildings can be a bit more complicated, especially these really energy efficient ones these days. If you've hired the commissioning agent, they're probably going to do this. And if not, it'll be a builder or the engineers. It's nice. You can probably get some training sessions. Sometimes these are recorded, which is great for the property manager. And especially if there's ever turnover later, ideally your building's going to be operational for a long time. So there'll probably be a little bit of turnover, and then they'll have this like manual for how to operate the system. And then these two things are happening actually during operations is your 6-month operating review and your 1-year warranty review. But we'll just include them here because it's technically part of the wrap-up process. And this is, again, another assessment of the building's condition. So kind of similar to that defects and deficiencies check. It's going to be all the same people, and you're just going through the building and noting anything that's not working. Yeah, when you've been operating for 6 months. And then very important that you get it in before your 1-year warranty is up. If it's outside of that, you will be paying for anything that's going wrong. So you want to make sure that you get it in within the 1 year. The thing is, like, you've spent a lot of money, time, effort on the building. So wrap up is making sure that it works the way you want it to. Don't feel like, oh, I'm complaining about something. Just tell them, get it fixed. Okay, and then takeaways from construction. So there's going to be continuous monitoring by the owner and the project manager, and make sure that you're adhering to, we like to think of it as 3 things: scope, schedule, and budget. Okay, so making sure that your project is following those 3, and if it's slipping on anything, that you know why. The owner is going to be playing a really crucial role in approving any change orders during construction. So change order process comes into play here. Funding advances are going to be received at different project milestones. So you need to really work with those. So if you're getting the 30% at 30% completion and you're submitting every month, just making sure that you're aligning all of the receipt of funding with your payment of invoices to maintain that positive cash flow. So you're not drawing on your own funds, that you're using the funding that you secured to be able to pay them. The owner, you're also going to be active in preparing for operational activities during this phase. So make sure that you're thinking about these things about 6 months out and noting any defects or deficiencies before move-in and over the first year of operation. Okay, we'll pause now for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyla. So just a reminder to folks, I know we had some people come in sort of after we jumped in here. So if you have questions for the presenters, please put them into the Q&A box. There aren't any in there at the moment. We'll just pause for a few seconds here in case someone is typing. We will have another chance for questions at the end. So do feel free to put questions in at any point during our presentation today, and we can get to those at the end. And I don't see anything at the moment, so why don't you keep going and we'll come back to questions in a little bit.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leah. Okay, so now that we're finished with construction, we're going to move into our last phase, which is operations. So the purpose of this phase is to facilitate the smooth move-in of residents into the new building and ensure effective day-to-day operations and the provision of services to your residents over the lifetime of the building. We'll be discussing today how to set up your building for operations. We won't be getting into specific operational policies. So some key activities in this phase include service planning. So this is going to involve setting up the systems and services that are required in your new facility. This would include fire and life safety systems, utility hookups, mail delivery, snow removal, etc. Service planning also includes setting up the anti-violence programs and services that your residents will be accessing. You're also going to be coordinating resident move-in. So you're going to be facilitating this move-in process and addressing any initial concerns or questions that the residents may have. You're also going to be wrapping up any responsibilities related to funding. So this activity is going to have you finalizing any outstanding financial matters related to construction funding that Kyla already mentioned earlier. And you're also going to be ensuring that all your financial reporting and your obligations are met. And finally, we're going to talk about taking care of the ongoing property management and maintenance of the building. So this is going to involve managing everyday tasks, collecting rent, maintaining resident relations. It's also going to include regular upkeep and prompt resolution of any maintenance issues, and ensuring that your organization adheres to financial plans and manages the budget accordingly. Ideally, the operations phase never truly ends, but completing all the activities in this phase is going to give you a fully functional building that provides safe, affordable, and wraparound support services for women and children fleeing violence. Okay, so how long does this phase take? The answer is it could last forever as long as your building is operational. Operations may change depending on the needs of the building and the residents, but the idea is that this phase continues indefinitely. And like I said earlier, we're going to be talking specifically today about setting up for operations. We won't be discussing specifically how to operate your building, but what you need to consider before your grand opening. So you'll want to consider the systems and services that will be in the building and what you'll need to set up each one. So, for your fire and safety plan, you may be hiring a professional consultant for the preparation of a comprehensive fire safety plan. This likely depends on the size of your building and if the builder has a subcontractor who can assist with this. You also must ensure that this fire safety plan complies with safety regulations and standards. Your build team will help you with that. The life safety systems include setting up an elevator phone line if applicable. So if you have an elevator in your building, you're also going to be scheduling regular inspections of your fire alarm and sprinkler systems and smoke detector inspections as well. For utilities and services, you're going to want to transfer utilities to your organization's name, or your utilities will be metered to the residents individually. We've heard of some shelters doing this, and they like to just to help their clients build up the credit. It's totally up to you, though. You're also going to want to arrange for property insurance and liability insurance coverage, set up your mail delivery services, organize your garbage and recycling collection services. This is going to involve, speaking to your municipality about that, and considering snow removal, grass cutting, etc. These things are easy to overlook or forget until you're actually in the building. It's good to have your list at the beginning, like Kyla mentioned, because some of these tasks are going to be happening at the end of construction, but you're going to need to continue them throughout the life cycle of the building. And also, as the support services provider, you're going to be responsible for any programs that are offered out of the building, both to residents as well as the larger community. So, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, some examples of these programs could include counseling, parenting courses, cooking programs, children's therapy programs, and more. So you do want to make sure that you'll have everything that you need for these programs prior to your resident move-in. Next comes the exciting part of actually moving your residents into the building. So before move-in, you'll want to set up all of your staff offices and the amenity spaces or common areas for residents if your building has those. You may also have a property management office, which should also be set up prior to move-in, just to ensure a smooth transition for your residents and so they know where to come find you if they have questions. Some shelters choose to furnish their second stage units and provide sheets, towels, and cutlery to residents, which are set up before move-in. You may want to consider this as an option. You may also want to schedule some unit inspections with your residents before move-in, just to address any concerns and ensure that the units meet their expectations. You'll likely want regular inspections while they're living in the units. We do hear that some shelters do complete a monthly check-in of the unit and a check-in on the resident as well. When securing residents to fill your units, you'll want to ensure that all of the necessary resident and program agreements are signed by all applicable parties just to formalize the arrangement. So, for second stage, this may look a bit different than a typical lease signing because residents will also be signing up for your program. So, making sure that you have all of that documentation for the housing, but also for the program requirements is important. You'll also want to provide instructions for residents on any fire safety procedures and emergency evacuation plans just to ensure their safety and well being throughout the duration of their stay. When moving your residents in, you might want to consider hosting a grand opening ceremony or a similar event to celebrate this milestone and make your residents feel more at home. So the key takeaway from this slide is that the move-in process is actually a really critical aspect of ensuring a positive resident experience and establishing a sense of community within the building. So you'll want to continue that feeling as residents change over as well. So keep that in mind when you're moving in new families. You'll also have a few more loose ends to tie with regards to funding in this phase. You will be preparing your final funding request to the funder once the construction contract is complete. You're also going to be working with a financial advisor to prepare a capital cost audit, and you'll be meeting with your accountant to prepare documentation for your tax rebate. For ongoing property management, you're going to want to prepare a maintenance plan for how the building will be upkept and how any maintenance issues or repairs are addressed. So, as Kyla mentioned earlier, you will have to arrange for a 1-year warranty check in. This will be essential if you have any issues with the building, and you'll want the builder to address these promptly as long as they're covered under the warranty. As the owner and property manager, you're also going to have a range of responsibilities, including resident relations, rent collection, control of operating expenses, financial reporting and record keeping, maintenance planning, capital expenditures, repairs, and addressing any security issues or breaches. Oh, and as a support services provider, you're also going to be responsible for any programs that are provided out of the building, both to residents as well as the community. Okay, so I just want to say before we wrap up, with some takeaways. I do want to mention that the operations and operational policies for second stage transitional housing could be a whole separate webinar series. Kyla's expertise is in project management of affordable housing. And while I've worked frontline at a shelter facility, I'm not an expert on all things shelter operations. We know that this is something, though, that many shelters are interested in and have questions about. So, in response to this, our knowledge exchange team at Women's Shelters Canada, this being Leah, our host of the webinar series today, is running a community of practice for 21 shelters that operate or will soon be operating second stage shelters. The community of practice is essentially a space for shelters across the country to discuss operations in their second stage housing, identify any challenges that folks are having, and work together to create solutions. They share really valuable knowledge, policies, and their expertise with one another. So the community of practice is currently closed, but there is a lot of value in this group where Women's Shelters Canada is hoping to make a plan to share this information and any learnings more widely. So stay tuned for that. If you have any questions about the community of practice for second stage operations, you can reach out to Leah. And I think Leah's going to put her email in the chat, but it's leah@endvaw.ca. So the operations section of this webinar was just meant to give you an idea of what items you'll need to consider before opening your new facility. So here are a few takeaways just to wrap up the phase. You'll want to consider what services will be needed for once you're operational and prepare for them before move-in. These will be the programs for your residents, as well as any property management services like garbage or snow removal. You're also going to want to prepare the units for move-in, sign any agreements, and create a welcoming and positive environment for your residents. And we do want to encourage you to take the time to celebrate this achievement, um, whether this be organizing a grand opening and inviting your team, or throwing a party for your residents when they first move in. We just want to encourage you to acknowledge the significant accomplishment of completing the project. Okay, so this concludes our operations phase, which means you've made it to the end of our webinar series. So congrats and thanks so much for being here with us. We're just going to quickly wrap up all three webinars. So we want to acknowledge that the entire development process may take many years. Some projects may take more than 10 years. Recognize that the process is never exactly as imagined. Each project is really unique with its own challenges and barriers. If you attended our first webinar, we talked about the squiggly line of your development journey. You're all gonna be on your own squiggly line with lots of challenges. It's not just gonna be a straight path to the end. You're going to want to hire a team that believes in the project and complements your strengths. Consider hiring consultants or experts if you lack specific development experience, and this will just help you and your project overall. Your board should be willing to take calculated risks to see the project through. And as an executive director, it's your job to help them prepare for this. You could tell them to watch this webinar series as a suggestion to help them prepare. You're going to want to involve your staff in the design of your building, especially your operations team, both for programs and the maintenance of the overall building. Having cash reserves is crucial. Even with secured grants, the money might not be accessible when you need it, as alluded to, when Kyla was talking about funding advances and the complications of that. Find a balance between the ideal design of the building and any cost considerations. So Kyla talked about balconies and how maybe in a project you really value outdoor space and having that for your residents. But balconies are expensive, and so maybe having a balcony for every unit isn't feasible because it costs too much. So instead, you're going to want to make a compromise, and perhaps you put one balcony per floor. And as I said, you're going to want to celebrate your milestones throughout the process, not just at the end of the grand opening. Any planning approvals, your groundbreaking, anything like that is going to be really helpful to cheer yourself on and keep your morale up. This is a big endeavor and you should be proud of yourselves. And with that, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions that folks have.
Amazing. Thank you, Megan. We do have a few questions coming in here, so I'm going to go through those. A few of them actually are about cash reserves. So, is there, an amount that should be put into cash reserves? Is there an amount that should be put aside before even considering looking into a build? Is there a percentage that you can go by? So, just more about cash reserves.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've heard people say 10% and kind of thinking that that was going to be an amount that you would need to think about contributing of your own money towards a project. Megan and I are working on a project right now where they've fundraised more than 30% of their total project costs. So I don't know that there's necessarily a hard and fast number. You're definitely going to have, like, you will be applying to other funds, and ideally you're having some success there, which means you don't have to raise as much. But at the outset, yeah, we've been talking to a few shelters that are kind of doing feasibility, and a lot of them are, give or take $50,000. A lot of them have sort of set aside either from surplus funds in previous years. Sometimes you get like a donation from a community member who like really believes in the second stage part, and maybe you can put that aside as well. But yeah, I'd say at the very outset, a few tens of thousands would be good. And then that should get you rolling to be able to hire somebody else to help you, likely a consultant that's done development before. They should then be applying to the pre-constructions and ideally kind of making their own money back. But there will be those moments throughout the project where you're sort of at a bit of a pinch point where maybe you've spent a lot of the funding and you're about to secure the next grant, but you're waiting on them or they don't give you the money right away. That's when you want to have that reserve available. But as far as your total project costs go, I'd be surprised if you could get away with less than 10% of your own funding put aside. If you can, that's awesome, but I would think to at least anticipate that that might be a number. And some of that can include, a little bit of capital fundraising as well, to be able to put towards that. And once you've had some momentum in terms of grants, it gets a little bit easier to secure some of that other funds because you're demonstrating like multiple levels of government are already invested. Always frame it as an opportunity for people to contribute to your project. That's a really good tip that Megan and I have heard, and framing it that way is we've had some success with that too.
Awesome, thank you. So one question that came in too is just about how to access the previous webinars so that they could be shared with a board. So I'm putting a link in the chat there to our webinar library. And so parts 1 and 2 are there right now in French and English. And then within about a week, we'll have this one up in French and English as well. There is a question here. What kind of approval from the board should be done in addition to the actual policies in place? Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I'm just going to note for the previous webinars, if you're on our SSTH new build project mailing list, Megan and I will send all 3 too, just because people have probably missed them. So you'll get a nice reminder from us with those links probably in sometime in July. Approval from the board. So usually when we start to talk to a shelter who says like, oh yeah, we're interested in building this, we often ask like, oh, like, is it in some of your strategic planning, right? Like, and I know other project managers will do that too with a board. It's kind of good to know that it's not just coming from staff, for example, right? Because you guys are on the ground, you know the desperate need, but if you don't have a board on board and having like bought in to that vision, you're probably it's just gonna be a bit more of a battle, right? Like trying to get your project done. So you want them to be on the same side as you. So if you're doing any sort of, yeah, like strategic planning, long-term visioning sessions with them, bring in whatever. So like, oh, our existing shelter is falling apart and we really want to try and get it replaced, or there's a huge need for second stage, or we just need more units, we want an extension on our building, any of those kinds of things. If you're talking about it in terms of like that long-term planning with your board, I think that's really good. Have those conversations there. And then that's kind of given your buy-in. You'll probably need their approval for things like hiring a project manager to work on it with you, or at least approval that you're going to explore hiring somebody, if they might not need to be involved in actually who is hired. And you'll want them probably to apply for certain funding too. If it's a bigger amount of funding, you'll want to run that by them. But it doesn't always have to be super formal. Like definitely get it in whatever regular meetings that you're having. If these are monthly, get it in those meeting notes, and then it's documented somewhere, right? And you can always refer back and say, oh yeah, there was a motion to explore a project manager as long as they cost less than $30,000. I don't know, I'm kind of making this up, but I think that that's a good way to do it, is through like motions in your regular meetings. And maybe it's less like a standing agenda item is like that project. So whenever you get through all of your other items, just make sure you're touching on that one. Are there any updates? Yes, no. Yes, this funding just opened last week. We're going to apply for it. If it's small funding, I mean, don't wait for your board, just get it in. But if it's, for example, related to a mortgage, absolutely, you definitely need the board's approval for that one.
Awesome, thank you. So there's no further questions in the Q&A at the moment. So why don't we move on, Amanda, to your portion, and then we will have more time for questions at the end. So keep putting those into the Q&A box while Amanda's speaking.
Thanks, Leah. For those of you just joining today, my name is Amanda Owens, and I'm the Executive Director of Ksan Society. We are located on the traditional unceded Tsimshian territory of the Kitsilts and Kitsim-Kalim people. These lands are located in northwestern BC, otherwise known as Terrace. I've been with Ksan Society since 2007. We're an umbrella organization operating anti-violence programs, multiple social housing programs, and food security programs. We are coming to the end of completion on our second stage housing project. It's 22 units. Prior to that, we've completed both a 45-unit affordable housing project and a 52-unit supportive housing project. Those were completed in 2019, and we're currently in the design phase of a 39-unit project. During construction, we found that it's very helpful to walk through your building frequently throughout the process. Walking through the building will give you a better idea of how it functions, and you'll be able to identify items that might need to be changed that hopefully won't impact the design or cost significantly. One of the things that we experienced in our second stage housing project walking through was in the laundry room, they had windows that look into the hallway. Well, the windows were set quite low, the height of the windows below counter height, and didn't look right to me. I thought that wasn't very functional. And so we asked them to raise the height of the window so that there could be counters below, or a table set below the window. And so they were able to make that change. Another item that was brought to our attention during a walkthrough was outside. It happened to be raining that day, which was lucky for us. Outside the building, off the roof, was a downpour of rain that came off of the gable and fascia end, and questioned the site superintendent about that and if that was being fixed, and that's how it was going to be throughout operations. And I said, well, that's not acceptable, because you have to think about things like when it's winter time and that water falling off of the edge of the roof, it becomes an icicle, and then how does it affect the ground with all that water pouring down. So we were able to get the construction crew to fix that, and so that going into operations, we wouldn't have an issue with the water drippage off the roof. So little things like that are really important throughout the construction phase. And so make sure you ask a lot of questions if you're unsure about something. As Kyla and Megan mentioned, connect with your service providers as early as you can throughout the process. For things like alarm monitoring, telephones, garbage, and IT. IT was a big one for us because I don't think that it's brought up very often what kind of IT equipment is required for Wi-Fi access and all of that. So we found that connecting with our IT service provider early on was very helpful so that all of those items were addressed before going into operations. In talking about financing, make sure that you talk to your bank about how those funds will flow through. We had issues that our limits weren't high enough. So once the funds were deposited in our bank account and we tried to send them out to the contractor, it actually was blocked by our bank. And so it delayed the payments by a few days. But so make sure that you talk to your banks and make sure that you have your limits high enough to flow those funds through because like Kyla said, they could be up and around $1 million and over that, depending on the size of your project. And also make sure that you have the proper approvals in place from a board level to flow those funds through appropriately. So once your project is complete and you do a final walkthrough, you're going to want to walk through each room and turn on every appliance, use every plug, faucet, make sure that everything's in working order, the hot water, the cold water, the showers. We found if you don't have everything checked, maybe everything isn't to working order and you want to get those addressed right away. Once tenants start moving into your building, it makes it much more harder to get in and fix any of those deficiencies. Also, do a staggered move-in of residents in your building. You don't want to move everybody in all at once. It can be quite overwhelming, and you want to get used to the building and how it functions. So doing a staggered move-in of your residents so that you can get used to it, the tenants can get used to it, and you can iron out any bumps in the road that you might encounter. We also set up a panel for a selection process for a second stage housing project. So our panel consists of our program coordinator, our program manager, and our housing manager, so that they can filter through all of the applications and do a selection process for residents. We also created an internal operations team, including our HR, to make sure that all our job descriptions were developed and we had our job postings completed. We established a timeline for hiring and a schedule for training and orientation. So we allowed about 2 weeks for training and orientation of our frontline staff. And we hired our program coordinator about a month early to help actually set up the building and make sure each unit is ready for your residents. Again, working with our funder to ensure all of our agreements are in place. They were able to supply us with a lot of draft participant agreements and policies. In BC, we have our association that we can connect with if we have any other questions. And there's a listserv where we can ask other operators across the province for support and documentation, which is a really great resource to be able to connect with people province-wide. And I think that was pretty much it for our experience with moving into operations of our project.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. So before we head into our last question period here, Megan, I'll pass it back to you for the final few slides there. And this is a great time for everyone to put your questions into the box.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leah. Okay. So this is the final webinar in our 3-part series. We hope that you learned a little bit today. If you missed an earlier session, they have been recorded. They're on our website. Leah has put the link in the chat, nvaw.ca/previous webinars, I believe is the URL. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Kyla and I have created multiple resources for you just to access on our webpage. When you get the copy of the slides, you can click these links and it'll take you right to where the resources live. If you have any ideas for resources that could be helpful, please reach out to us and we'll do our very best to create it. We really want to create resources that are going to help assist you in your project. That's our goal at the end of the day. So if you have anything that you need, let us know. You can also sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter is designed to keep shelters informed about valuable opportunities and resources related to developing new second stage housing or shelter projects. We share things like funding announcements and opportunities, relevant news, and the resources that we develop as they become available. And like Kyla said, look out for, if you're already on our mailing list, look out for an email with the recordings to these 3 webinars. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and we look forward to answering any questions that have come up since then.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So one question actually that had been submitted after our last webinar was about funding opportunities and what funding opportunities might be available for this kind of construction build process.
Yeah, I feel like that was also the highest percentage on the poll at the start of this too. People always want to know where the money is, and we are trying to outline a lot of that. So Megan and I have created like for national funding, it outlines both the CMHC, so Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, and FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. There are capital funding programs, so trying to just make it a little bit easier when you're first trying to assess, like, well, which one should I apply for? Which one do I start applying for? And then the others. So recommend that you look at those. There should also be provincial and municipal, well, hopefully municipal or local government funding for you too. But ideally there's some sort of provincial program. Obviously it depends on the province. I am going to share a link in this after that FCM. They've actually created where they let you like choose which province you're in, and then there's a few funding programs there. It's a little bit, you kind of got to weed through them a bit. They might not all be applicable for your project, but I'll share that after just to help. And then you should also look at applying to different like foundations and corporations. For an example, if you were on our mailing list, you would have seen one of the programs that RBC is putting out. It's like a community infrastructures fund. So you could apply to that one. Rona put out one not too long ago. And as far as foundations go, like Megan and I worked on a few of those for a project. It can take a while. You tend to get quite a few rejections. But we had good news this week where we were successful with one that we applied to like last September. So it's absolutely worth putting those in, not just when there's a call, but just demonstrating the need for your project, why they should be on board, why it's an opportunity for them to give to you, because they're going to give money to somebody. So it should be your project. And then you also might think about, I mentioned before, like a capital fundraising campaign that could be useful. Maybe not the first step when you have $0, but once you have a little bit, that you're able to kind of ask for people to also donate. And that probably depends on the size of your community, what kind of donors are available there and that you have access to. Some shelters hire somebody to work on this for them. Some have fundraising on their staff, but even if you don't, if you're working on a new build, you've probably hired a project manager and they should know where all of these funding programs are, right? Like that's what Megan and I were doing for this other shelter, and applying to the foundations, applying to all 3 levels of government. So there is stuff out there. It tends to be that you've got to access everybody and put it all together. That was that funding stack that we talked about in webinar number 2. But hopefully you have a bit of luck, at least in a couple places.
Great. And there's a follow-up to that. How do we know about these funding possibilities like RONA, RBC? How do you find out?
Sign up for our mailing list. That would be my number one. Yeah, we put out the RBC one on our mailing list when things come out. We did the same thing for the CMHC seed grants that were available last March. The RONA one, it was a bit word of mouth, and to be honest, the way that the funding was allocated and the size, it didn't actually make sense for us to put on our mailing list, so we didn't do that one. But yeah, like some of it is word of mouth, definitely the mailing list. And if you have a project manager or some sort of consultant, that they should be in tune with these opportunities as well.
I just want to add to that, Kyla, that a lot of this stuff is just like a lot of the funds and that we're finding. It's a Google search, but it's a strategic one. A lot of corporations have foundations attached to them, and depending on what the corporation is and what their values are, like RBC seems to have this infrastructure fund, right? And that would align really well with second stage projects. And Rona, they have a build from the heart program, I suppose, because they're they sell hardware materials, that's something that they're connected with. So it's really like a Google search, to be fully honest, because some of the opportunities out there, they may be, less money, but still valuable at the end of the day. If you're struggling to close your funding gap, the more that you can apply, the better your outcome will be in getting your project off the ground.
Yeah, and I like Megan's working on a document as well to kind of outline sort of how you even find those corporations and foundations to begin with, and what you want to sort of put into the application. So we'll hopefully have that resource for people maybe in the coming months. But it probably takes a bit of learning how to search.
Yeah, it's not an easy process for sure. And I feel like it's just something that's ongoing, especially for nonprofits and charities, even just to find cover operating dollars, I'm sure you all can relate. So I totally empathize with this process.
Awesome. Thank you. So I don't have any further questions in the Q&A box here. We'll give folks a few seconds here in case there is something someone wants to ask. We can still take a few more questions. Go ahead, Kyla.
Can I ask Amanda, like you were talking about like in terms of doing the walkthroughs and stuff. So you want to like who did the walkthroughs with you, or was it just you and like the project manager? And I mean, I liked your examples. I thought they're brilliant. Did you have like a bit of a list of like, oh, this is stuff I should be looking for? Or what was your lens there?
No, it's interesting because obviously when you're doing the design, you look at these prints and you see these, but when you walk through the building, it's so different. Pre-COVID, we used to do, like you were talking about, those meetings on site every month with the development consultant, the, architect and the contractor. Now we're doing virtual ones. And so we kind of set the stage off right from the beginning, saying that we will, connect with the site superintendent on a regular basis as the owners and do walkthroughs. So it was just us and the site superintendent walking through, and yeah, you just see little things as you're there, and that you would never see on a set of plans. And that's why, like, every stage of the process, it's really, really important to be there and visualize how it's all coming together and how it works for you as an operator. And it's really important to advocate for yourself and your program and your staff what you need going into operations, because if you don't, it ends up being a disaster sometimes.
Yeah. And when you say us, like, was it you and another staff person?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. I have a coworker that we do all these projects with. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. And a question, how do we get on the mailing list that you keep mentioning?
Yeah. Thank you. There's a couple ways that you can do this. So when Leah sends out the slides for the presentation deck, you can open it up. It's a PDF and go to the last slide, click the link, and that will take you directly to our sign up list. But you can also visit our website, ndvaw.ca, and go to the second stage transitional housing new build project. And on all of our pages on the side bar on the left, you can sign up there too. It's a quick sign up. So if you're having any trouble, feel free to send myself or Kyla an email and we can sign you up. But there's a couple different ways to do it.
Thanks. And I have just put the link to the second stage project website in the chat there. So like Megan said, if you open that up right now on the left-hand side, you can sign up right away. Awesome. So I don't see further questions. So maybe I can just take this opportunity to say a huge thank you at the end of our three-part series to the presenters. So to Kyla, Megan, Amanda, thanks for putting all of this together over the course of the 3 sessions. It's been such a huge amount of really helpful information. And I know, from the questions and all of that, folks have really appreciated that. So thank you all so much for putting this together, putting the time in, sharing it in such an accessible way. And I also want to thank our interpretation team that's been here today and the folks who did the previous sessions. It really couldn't be done without you. So thank you for that. And finally, I'll say thank you as well to everyone who has come out to participate, because this is what they're here for. And so having your questions, having your input, having you here listening is such an important part. So thank you to everyone, and we will get these recordings up and we look forward to continuing the conversation.